Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to so many people for coming here today. It's really amazing to see the turnout. Today I'm going to tell you about three things. First, I'm going to start with sharing some research that we recently completed about how Koreans are installing and uninstalling apps. Then, I'm going to tell you about a usability study of mobile apps that Google recently completed. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about some of the learnings and insights that we developed from this study. So I'm Phil Mattia. I'm the mobile apps lead for Korea and Greater China, and it's my pleasure to share some of these insights with you. Before we start, I just want to share some context on why this is important. Today, there are 1.5 million apps in each of the iOS and Android app stores. Getting discovered is a really big challenge. It's competitive and it's crowded. So we really want to avoid any possibility that a flaw in user experience could cause us to lose apps. Does anybody think that poor user experience could be contributing to the way that people are using apps? Well, globally, we see that of all of the apps that are installed, about 1 in 4 are only used once ever and then never used again. What about in Korea? This is some research that we did in partnership with TNS of Korean app users. And what we found out is that today, Korean app users on average have 53 apps installed on their phone. This is one of the highest in the world. And not only that, they're still installing new apps. So on average, people in Korea install 4 apps every month and uninstall 3. That's a net gain of 1 app about every single month. So this 53 is steadily rising. That's a lot of apps. So even if you can acquire a user, convince them to install your app, there are 52 other apps on that person's phone that you have to compete with. That's a lot of apps. Let's explore some of the reasons why Koreans install and uninstall apps. According to our research, the number one reason why Koreans install apps is because of good user reviews. This is not surprising, right? If a user uses your app, they have a great experience, they write a good review, that's going to be the best way for you to convince more users to try your app. What about why they uninstall it? Well, it turns out, here in Korea, the main reason why people uninstall an app is because they don't find it useful or they don't find it relevant anymore. So what can we do to help make apps as useful and easy to use as possible? This is exactly what we set out to do with our usability study. Google partnered with AnswerLab to do a study of mobile app user experience because we wanted to make a really impactful and broad study, and AnswerLab helped us do that. So let me tell you a little bit about how we did this study. We did one-on-one individual interviews with 103 people. We sat down with them, and we had them use their own phone to use 6 different apps and do activities that they would do every day, performing key conversions within a variety of apps. The apps that we chose for the study were 100 different apps across categories, from retail to travel to local services, and a wide range of consumer services apps from both large companies and small companies. Now, I want to be very clear, we did not include gaming in this study, and we did that on purpose. The reason is because we feel that gaming probably deserves its own separate user experience study that would be quite different than a lot of the other categories. So we left that out. We conducted these interviews in the US, in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. And we learned some really interesting things. Some of the findings from this research, and by the way, if you do the math, that's 155 hours, so we had a lot of data. And some of the findings from this data we found very interesting. We got some of the most widespread trends and patterns that we found from this user experience research, and we incorporated it into a list of 25 principles, which I will share with you today. I'm just going to pick a few of them to share because we don't have a lot of time, and the rest of them are available online for you to check out later. Now, in order for a principle to make it into this 25 list, we had to see that it was prevalent across all of the different app categories and appearing in many different interviews that we conducted with our panelists. The 6 categories that we ended up aligning on were these: app navigation and exploration, in-app search, commerce and conversions, registration, form entry, and usability. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time going through these 6, and I'll share with you just a few of the principles for each one. And I'll also share some resources and free tools that you can all use to apply these principles to your apps. So you can feel free to take pictures with your cameras when we get there. So let's start with app navigation. The first principle I want to share is about location. Now, a great feature in apps is the ability to auto-detect the user's location based on GPS. But one thing that we noticed in our research was that this feature was actually getting overly used, in the sense that users were not being given an option to pick an alternate location. So if you see on the left here, you can see that the option is given to find hotels near me. But what if I want to find hotels somewhere else? Let's say, for example, I'm looking for movie tickets, and I want to watch a movie near where my parents live as opposed to where I live. It's important to give people the option to enter their own manual location. So we found that the apps that received better user feedback and ratings were the ones that had the manual option entered. The next principle is about transitions to the mobile web. When necessary, it's important to make sure that this transition from app to web is as seamless as possible. And let me first start by saying when necessary, because no matter what you do, with today's current technology, to get someone from an app and move them over to the web environment will cause some delays. And Google is doing some things to speed this up, but today there's going to be a delay no matter what you do. So we encourage you to think long and hard if you really need to move someone to the web, or if there's some way to keep them in the app environment with what they're doing. But we understand there are certain situations where you have to move them to a web environment to complete the task. Now, I want to point you to this example on the left side. If you notice, when the user moves to the web, they're taken to an experience that looks like that. And this actually causes a lot of confusion on the part of the user, because it removes them from the design experience and the layout that they're in, and it takes them to something completely different. This overall decreased the favorability of the particular conversion experience for the app. And we found that apps which did something more like on the right got better ratings. We understand that a lot of times within the company, the mobile web team and the mobile app team, they sit in different places, and maybe they don't talk to each other as much as they should. But if we can ensure that there's a seamless transition in terms of the layout and the color scheme and the design, that will help contribute to an overall better user experience when you have to move them to the mobile web. Another tool that you can consider leveraging is Chrome custom tabs. Chrome custom tabs have one benefit, which is that they allow you to customize the color of the address bar to fit with the design scheme of your app. But even better, they're really, really fast. So in our benchmarking tests, we found that dead last was WebView. WebView is really slow. So If you want to use an experience where you're taking a user from an app to the web, we suggest trying Chrome Custom Tabs. And here is the first link. There will be a number of other ones where you can find out more about Chrome Custom Tabs. Now let's move on to in-app search. The first principle I want to share about in-app search is related to finding the search button itself. One thing that we found very often is that in contexts where the user wants to find something, it's not always easy for them to find the search button. If you see the example on the left, the search button is text only, and it's hidden a little bit up in this menu. In other situations, it was hidden in a side panel or likewise. We found that at least using an icon, a search icon, which is often the looking glass, like this, or even including a persistent search bar at the top of the app everywhere where search is important, provides a better user experience. And here are some resources that you can use to implement these kinds of search functionality in your app. The first link are the material design principles around search. And there's two different options. If you feel that search is very important for your app, you can do what is called persistent search, where the search bar is always present at the top. If you feel like it's maybe not quite important enough to merit having a persistent search bar, material design also offers some principles around having an expandable search bar for when the user taps on it. Next, there's a resource that is a little bit more technical on the implementation of creating a search interface. Also, we found that the search experiences within apps that provided auto-suggestions tended to have a better feedback from the users. So, two different resources for you on adding suggestions to automatically populate below the search bar are, first of all, adding custom suggestions. What this does is it allows the content within your app to dictate what shows up in the auto suggestions. Also, when it comes to search, we actually found that a lot of times people were repeating the same searches. So they search for it once, then they look, and then they go back and they search for it again. So implementing something like this, where you have the most recent queries that someone typed in showing up at the top of the list, tended to work really well for users. So if you want to implement that, here's the resource for that. And when people search and they exhaust their options with search, they often will go to filters in order to narrow down the search even more. So it's really important to provide a smart and easy-to-use filter option when people have a search result like this. 242 results. That's far too many for us to expect the user to continue scrolling through, and they probably will never find the shirt that they want, right? A better experience is if you offer a filter button that's prominent like this. I particularly like this implementation of filter. It pulls out a drawer that comes from the right, and it has a few options. First of all, of course, you can see to apply filters, you can hit this button right here. But also, if the user decides, you know what, I don't want to apply these filters, I just want to go back, there's an easy way to do that with this X up here. So that's pretty nice how they did that. Now let's move on to commerce and conversions. Of course, it's very important. Once you get the user all the way through and they're ready to pay or they're ready to transact with you, it's very important that we can make it as seamless and easy as possible to collect the payment from the user, right? So when it comes to payments, one thing that we found which was quite painful often for users was the credit card entry process or the payment method entry process. Sometimes we found that within apps, when someone is going through the process to complete a transaction and they get to the payment methods section, there's no way to actually change the payment methods. That's hidden somewhere else in the app, maybe in the settings, but now they've gotten to the point where they want to pay, and they can't change it. So, of course, we suggest making sure that when someone is in the checkout process, they can add new payment methods. But also, it's important to consider this. Sometimes people want to change or update or maybe even delete a previous payment method. So it's also important to make sure that people can edit their existing payment methods in that same view. And if you look on the right here, you can see that this particular example has implemented a few different options for people to transact. And we found that when people have more options, generally speaking actually across many of these principles, more options was generally a good thing. So as long as it wasn't slowing down the experience, giving people a few different options is always helpful. And finally, one more option that you can consider is the option to let people scan their credit card with their camera. It's an easy way to allow people to not have to type in all of those numbers. Now let's move on to registration and form entry. Now, it's really important in certain contexts to make sure that people can fill out fields very easily so they can get to the content that they want to get to. I think we've all seen this before. You're trying to type in your password, you just can't remember it, and you have all this red, and you just can't get past it. This, of course, is a very frustrating user experience that people have. So, again, a recurring theme, we found that when there was more than one option for people to authenticate into the app, it was better. And in fact, one thing that we found is that people really love to use the fingerprint sensor on their phone. So when it's available for that device, we definitely encourage you to implement the option to authenticate with a fingerprint scan. And of course, there's always the option to allow third-party authentication like Facebook or Kakao or something like that. Here are the resources if you want to implement these yourself. Again, strongly encourage fingerprint authentication. This was a big win with the users that we studied in our research. And also another option is to implement a smart lock feature instead of a text password. Next principle is on form entry. So one of the things that is difficult on a phone is filling out lots and lots of text fields. It becomes even more difficult if when you do it, the keyboard starts to cover up the text field. So given the keyboard takes up almost half the screen on a phone, right? So it's very easy, if we don't make certain little tweaks, that the keyboard will end up covering up the rest of the form. We found that the apps which provided a better user experience were the ones that implemented a feature where the form automatically moves up as the user moves further down through the different fields in the form, so that you can make sure that the keyboard is never in the way of the form of the field that you're filling out right now. And finally, when it comes to form entry, it's very important to make sure that you are matching the keyboard that comes up with the type of information that the user wants to input. So this happens a lot. I don't know if it's ever happened to anybody here. It's certainly happened to me. You need to enter in a long number, like a phone number or a credit card number, and then up pops this thing right here. And now, what do? Well, you have to hit this, right? So you hit the number button, and then the numbers are sort of like a narrow little strip up here. It's very easy to make a mistake when you're hitting in numbers on a standard QWERTY keypad. Users loved it much more when the app was smart enough to know, for this field, since it's a number, let's give the user a number keypad. And this is something that, in a second, I'll share the resource for. This is not that hard to actually implement for the fields in your forms. So here are some of the resources, and let me just go through each one of these. First of all, this is the material design guidelines on text fields to make sure that the design and layout of your text fields is not getting obstructed by other visual elements in your app, like the keyboard. Also, with the Places API, it's very easy to do the feature that we talked about in the very beginning, which is to auto-detect the user's location. And that's this resource right here. Another thing with the Places API is that it allows you to easily integrate with surfacing any place, any address, autocomplete when the user starts typing it in. So again, if the user does choose to manually enter in an address, it's very nice that the rest of the address just appears and they don't have to finish typing the whole thing. That can be accomplished via the autocomplete functionality in the Places API. And then finally, the way to easily implement this feature that I'm talking about, where the number keys come up for a number and the letter keys come up for letter input, is this final resource here. So this is the way to make sure that the input method that you're specifying for a particular field is matched to the type of input that the user has. And finally, the last section I'm going to talk about is usability and comprehension. So the first principle in this category I want to talk about is about making sure that you have text labels that clarify a particular image or visual cue that you're providing in the app. If you look at this example here, you can see that there's 4 different buttons on the bottom of the app. So maybe most people, when they see this, they'll know this means something like my account, right? But if you didn't see this, what do you think this would mean? A lot of times, app developers, they are guilty of thinking that the user thinks like they think. And sometimes users are coming from a very different kind of context and a very different experience than we come from. And so it can always be helpful to test something like this alongside this. I think in this example, it's safe to say that it's probably better to have the text versus not having it. But of course, we would always suggest doing an A/B test to see which one performs better, which one gets better engagement, right? And this is super easy to do if you use Firebase via remote config. So here are some resources when it comes to usability. First of all, here are some guidelines around text plus icon for buttons to implement something like we're talking about here. And then finally, some information and tools on making sure that your apps are accessible to people who have various types of impairments, to make sure that they can use your apps as well. And the final principle that I want to talk about today is to make sure that you're asking for permissions in context. So Android Marshmallow has enabled a feature to ask for permission for something at runtime, as opposed to when the app is being installed. We highly encourage this feature, and it's also available on iOS, because users, when asked to give permission to an app outside of context, they very often reacted and they said no, because they didn't know why they were being asked for this permission. This is a perfect example right here. Allow the app to use your location. They just opened the app for the first time. Why? They said no, right? And the problem with this is that a lot of the times it actually sort of breaks the app. It makes the app not work the way that it's supposed to. And then the user blames it on the app, right? Because it's not working the way they wanted it to, and they give it a bad rating. Well, isn't it much better if you give the user a reason to share a certain permission? Like in this example, the user has chosen that they want to search for a store location. So now they're telling the app developer, yes, I want to find a store. And then after they tap that button, the app asks them, can we use your location? Of course you can use my location. I just asked to find a store. How could I find a store without my location, right? So the user goes from saying, oh, I don't know about this. I want to say no. It makes me nervous, to saying, of course I'll share my location. And that's the kind of difference that context and providing a clear benefit towards sharing the information provides. Here is the resource on requesting permissions at runtime, and you can learn more about how to implement something like this. So thank you, everybody, for your time. I actually wanted to share, this is the link to all of the 25 principles, as well as some other useful mobile UX advice that we have on the site. But before I finish, I wanted to share an interesting story that we had from doing our user research. So I talked about the scan credit card feature before, right? Well, as it turns out, not every single user has used this feature before. And when you think about the word scan in English, a lot of times, in most contexts, that means things pressing against each other. You would scan a piece of paper in a copier, or you would scan your passport when you're checking in, right? Well, what do you think, for these users who never did this before, what do you think that they did when they got to this screen? It's not that unreasonable, though, right? I laughed as well, but then you think, well, if the user is coming from a place where, in their mind, they've never used this before, they only know the word scan, is it that unreasonable that they tried to do this? Now, of course, this doesn't work. Maybe one day it will. But the users were frustrated. When they're holding their card there and nothing is happening, right? They pull the card away and nothing. So the reason why I wanted to share this story is because it's very important for us to remember that our users don't always think the way that we think. And we need to really make sure that the user experience is so simple, so easy, that they don't have to think the same. Thank you.